Hello, my friends. Deepak here again, and we are continuing our conversations with luminaries, influencers, storytellers, and everyone who is contributing to the new humanity. And our goal always is one only, and that is to reach a critical mass of consciousness for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. Now, in previous conversations, you've heard me speak about my LSD experiences in medical school when I was 17 or 18. And today, this has become a major conversation in our time, whether we call them psychedelics or in the past hallucinogens and theogens, it doesn't matter. But the future of well being is definitely going to have to include a conversation on the role of, let's call them psychedelics or plant based medicines that alter our experience of consciousness and what their role is in treating mental illness, suicide prevention, chronic illness. As I've mentioned before, chronic illness, only 5% is related to fully determined gene expression. The rest is all based on how we modify our gene expression. So there's a lot to talk about. But certainly, one of the great authorities on this subject is no other than Michael Pollan. I'm holding his book in my hand, How to Change Your Mind, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness. The only thing I'm interested in, dying. Dying, I'm preparing for it right now. Addiction, I'm a recovering from addict, moving from spirits to spirit. And depression, we've all had existential depression. And finally, transcendence, the ultimate goal. So there's nothing more important than discussing these topics. And as you can see, Michael has another book on his bookshelf. Michael, can you just share it with us for a moment? Just show it on the,
Yeah, here, let
yeah,
me
if you
pull up
have
a
it.
more convenient copy. So my new book is called This Is Your Mind on Plants.
Yeah.
And it continues my exploration of psychedelics, but also broadens the scope to take in some very common drugs like caffeine that 90% of humanity are involved with on a daily basis, and opium, which
Okay.
has been the
Great.
source of so much suffering in the last few years in America, but is also, under certain circumstances, a blessing of nature.
Yeah. You know, my brother is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and he used to be the dean of education at Harvard too. And he's recently written a book on the benefits of coffee, why we should all be taking coffee to prevent Alzheimer's, 5 types of cancer, alcoholic cirrhosis, and so on. So I
Yeah,
am
there are a lot of benefits to caffeine. I think it surprises people. And the reason, though, is interesting. It may not be the caffeine, it may be the antioxidants in coffee and tea, which, believe it or not, are the coffee and tea are the biggest source of antioxidants in the American diet, which just tells you how few vegetables we're eating.
that's it. So we'll get to that. But Michael, because some of our audience may not be familiar with you, I haven't discussed psychedelics in the past. I'd love to have you share a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, your influences, how you actually got to be speaking about what we're speaking about today.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I grew up on suburban Long Island, outside of New York City, about 40 miles, in a town called Woodbury. Classic suburban upbringing, public school. The thing that I see now looking back that influenced me profoundly going forward is gardening. I was a passionate gardener from the age of 8. Influenced by my maternal grandfather, a man named Max Staller, who immigrated from Russia in 1917 with nothing and knowing no one, or virtually no one, and began selling baked potatoes and other produce from a cart in Hempstead, New York. gradually became a dealer of vegetables, fresh produce, and then a distributor, and built a business around that, and then became a developer. He got to know all the farmers on Long Island, and then he eventually, when they wanted to sell their land, he bought it and developed it as usually as shopping centers. But he never lost his passion for produce, and even as an old man, and he lived to be 96 or 97, he always had a garden. And my favorite place to be for my childhood was in his garden in August or September, when there was ripe produce, peppers and potatoes and tomatoes and squash. And I was just blown away by these gifts of nature. The fact that these things of value, these things that people paid money for, could come from a seed in a plant. And I started gardening myself in imitation of him. And I had a little strip of land right along this edge of my house by the foundation. And I called it a farm because I wanted to sell what I grew. And I did. I would sell it to my mother whenever I managed to grow 4 or 5 strawberries, put them in a cup and sell them to my mother. And this love of gardening and the kind of miracles, the alchemy that takes place there, the genius of plants, has stuck with me. And my writing really, so I'll skip ahead, but I was gardening until I was a teenager, where most people lose interest in gardening, and we're much more interested in mobility than staying put. I studied literature in college. I was passionate about literature. To my great regret, I never studied science in college. It was a progressive time where you could get away with skipping science entirely. So as a science journalist, I've had to do a lot of catch up and depend on generous scientists to teach me what I don't know, which is quite a bit. But after I got out of school, I worked as a magazine editor for many years. I was an editor at Harper's Magazine for 10 years. I didn't think it was realistic career ambition to be a writer. I didn't know anyone who made a living as a writer. So I thought the next best thing was to be around writers, to be around reading, and to work at a magazine. And I did that for many years with great pleasure. While I was at Harper's, I started gardening again. We bought a little house in rural Connecticut, about 2 hours outside of New York, and we would spend weekends there gardening and eventually writing. And I started writing pieces, essays, about what was happening in my garden, which I came to see was a laboratory for working out a healthier relationship with the natural world. And I learned this, I backed into this knowledge because initially I screwed it up completely. I got into a real war with a woodchuck or groundhog, and that was eating my crops. And I did some things I'm not very proud of as someone who is thought of as an environmental writer, including pouring gasoline down its burrow and lighting matches and poisoning it in various ways. And but that's when I realized that our sense of entitlement in nature, our arrogance, is a problem. And so I began writing essays about what I was learning about the natural world as a gardener. And that became my first book, Second Nature, which was published in 1991. And in a way, all my books have been about plants and our relationship to plants and what they give us. And a lot of people, so if you care about that, if you care about the human engagement with the natural world, eventually you're going to write about food, because we change nature more through our agriculture than anything else we do. We change the landscape, we change the composition of species. The species that thrive are the ones we eat. And the ones that threaten the species we eat are the ones that are extinct or going extinct. And then we change, as we've learned, the atmosphere. That agriculture contributes mightily to climate change through deforestation and through plowing. And so I wrote several books, and the books I'm probably best known for still about agriculture and food and nutrition.
I read them.
You have. Well, that means a lot to me to hear that, Deepak. And then, but something else we use plants for that is less often thought about, less obvious, but really curious, is that humans, all humans, with one exception, have used plants or fungi to change consciousness. That is another desire that some plants have gratified, have evolved to gratify. And it's a curious desire because it doesn't seem like it would be adaptive, off the bat. I mean, that, getting high puts you at risk. You're at risk of accidents. You're at risk of being preyed on by other creatures. You're more vulnerable. So what is the benefit of changing consciousness using plants? If there were no benefit, and if the risks outweighed the benefits, obviously natural selection would have done away with the drug takers a long time ago. But interestingly enough, it hasn't. So that made me want to investigate that. And I've in How to Change Your Mind, and This Is Your Mind on Plants, and in a section of Botany of Desire that dealt with cannabis, I've looked at this question of how consciousness change achieved through ingesting of plant chemicals may benefit our species, may lead to higher forms of consciousness, or at least introduce us to them, and also create, introduce kind of what I think of as mutations in the realm of culture, new ideas, new metaphors, solutions to problems. There's a long history of how individual minds engaging with certain molecules has led to breakthroughs. And if the human imagination has a natural history, which I think it does, one of the forces acting on that natural history are these consciousness changing substances. And so I've been interested in that for a long time, and that's what these last two books have dealt with. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope that.
No, I like that answer because it kind of encapsulates your journey. You said one exception. What is that?
Yes. So when in the 70s, they surveyed various cultures to see who used plants, which ones used plants. And the Inuit in Greenland did not use plants to change consciousness. And the only reason was that nothing psychoactive grows where they live. And when alcohol was introduced, they took to it pretty quickly. So it appears to be a universal human desire. There's something about us, and I'd be curious to know what you think, why you think this is, that isn't satisfied with everyday normal consciousness and wants to transcend it in some ways or vary its texture. Why do you think?
So here is, I'll tell you my take on it, but I want to get as much information from you
I
as
know, but I want to learn from you.
okay. So I want to go all the way to where the future policy
Yes.
should be and how it's going to influence economy and health and well-being and
We will get there.
we'll get there. But here's I grew up in a culture where consciousness was the ontological primitive of the universe, period. Okay, so right now we have this whole debate, is matter the ontological primitive of the universe or consciousnesses? And as you know, there's a hard problem in consciousness. We can't explain any experience, even this experience we're having. All that's happening in your brain is electrochemical activity, but you're hearing sound, you're seeing images, you're having thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, imagination, creativity, insight, inspiration. There's no way, according to the wisdom traditions that I grew up in, you could explain any experience by invoking force fields, gravity, atoms, and molecules. How do they conspire to create inspiration or a story or a myth or a religious experience? So I grew up with the idea that current science, and I didn't know these words, but as I engage with neuroscientists, my main training right now, I would say my education was internal medicine. I took board certification in internal medicine, then endocrinology, then neuroendocrinology, and my professor Seymour Reichlen was he's now 96, by the way, and he's still looking at the hard problem of consciousness. If he finds a snake in his garden, He'll dissect the hypothalamus to look for TRH receptors, opioids, all kinds of things. He comes once a year to New York on a sabbatical. He's 96, and he
Oh.
gives the most elegant lecture you can imagine on molecules of emotion, serotonin, opiates, dopamine, oxytocin. I grew up with him 40 years ago. He was my mentor, my hero, and still is. 96, he's still addressing these amazing problems with the amazing, most amazing clarity. So I was totally taken with this idea that current science, effective though it is, we are using Zoom right now.
Mhm.
We have artificial intelligence, we have VR. But in the Vedantic traditions, we are already in a VR. This is virtual reality that we have. And all our technology is actually extending the VR experience. That's it. So if you assume that consciousness is fundamental, then you go back to the religious traditions that I come from. And one of the most profound texts in the Rig Veda, the ninth mandala is dedicated to something called Soma. Okay. And Soma is the elixir of immortality. And it bypasses all the dark alleys and the secret passages and the ghost-filled attics of the conditioned mind, edits them out, and exposes you to formless, non-local, infinite being. And Tagore and Einstein in 1930 had a conversation about this. And they met in Berlin before the war broke out. And of course, Einstein was the preeminent scientist of his time. And Tagore was not so well known, but he had won the Nobel Prize for literature. And they had this conversation where Einstein said there's a scientific view of the world and there's a human view of the world. And so Tagore responded by saying the scientific view is also that of the scientific human being. And therefore, it's a construct, it's a mental construct in consciousness. And Einstein was gracious enough to say to Tagore, science is my religion. And I got it at that moment that Einstein was being so honest that current science is based on assumptions of physical world, number one, subject object split, number two, an embodied observer that can never be found. There's an embodied observer can't be found because there isn't one. The body is an experience in awareness. So is the mind an experience in awareness. So that awareness has no form. It has, and Tagore said in one of his poems, in this playhouse of infinite forms, I encountered the formless. And so my life was blessed. So the formless nature of existence became an obsession for me all my life. And at 17 in medical school, India, you go to medical school a little earlier because pre-med is only 1 year or whatever. I'm going to be 75 this year. So I grew up with these guys, Ram Dass and,
Mhm.
all the LSD crowd. And we had some LSD experiences in medical school where I was looking at a poster of Mother Teresa, and she was hugging and licking the wounds of children with leprosy.
Mm.
And the rumor was she healed them. When she did that, and immunoglobulins went up. So when I took that first LSD experience, only twice LSD, I had this immense compassion and desire to alleviate suffering, which never left me. And so medical school went on to become endocrinology, neuroendocrinology, now the hard problem of consciousness. And that's my story, and I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Now I want to ask you some very important questions.
That's great. Thank you for that background. That's very helpful. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting about psychedelics is that many people come out of the experience feeling a conviction that that idea that consciousness is primary to matter. And it's a very common epiphany that people have on psychedelics. And
The ninth mandala of the Rig Veda is dedicated to Soma. Now, we don't know what Soma is. I
that's
just
right. We
Googled
haven't identified it. but we know it was some consciousness changing substance.
And I can tell you, when my father passed away, he was a cardiologist. We were taking his ashes to the Ganges up in the Himalayas. My brother was with me. And on our way up, we saw all these holy men with ashes and smeared all over, naked, sitting by the Ganges. They all looked stoned. So my brother asked the taxi driver, he said, "What are they smoking?" He said, "Ganja, sir." So then my brother said, "Can we get some?" But the taxi driver said, "No, sir, you have to be enlightened." So there we are, totally different universe.
Yeah.
Anyway, Michael, I want to ask you, when did you begin to experiment with these
Well,
substances?
I was afraid to use them when I was 17, Deepak. I just came of age at a moment. I'm almost 10 years younger than you, 9 years younger than you. And by the time I was aware of psychedelics, the backlash, the moral panic had begun. And all we heard about LSD in school and in the media was that it scrambled your chromosomes and caused you to jump off of buildings thinking you could fly and staring at the sun till you went blind. All these myths that were promulgated, and bad science that was out there. And so I was too afraid to touch it. And I did not use psychedelics except for some pretty minor experiments with psilocybin in my 20s, in my late 20s, but not a substantial dose, until I was nearing 60 and had begun on the journey that led to How to Change Your Mind. That began when I heard about these experiments going on at NYU and Johns Hopkins to give psilocybin, which is the ingredient in magic mushrooms, to people who had terminal cancer diagnoses, people who were struggling with anxiety and depression and what the doctors called existential distress. And these people were having, in most cases, about 2/3 of the cases, these transformative experiences where they lost their fear of death. And that was so extraordinary to me that a single dose of a drug could change one's outlook on life and death in the course of 4 or 5 hours, that I became intensely curious to learn more. And I realized the only way I was really going to learn what I needed to do was to have some experiments myself. So I embarked on a journey where I tried several different psychedelics, including psilocybin, but also LSD and 5-MeO-DMT and MDMA, the whole menu, or virtually the whole menu, and mescaline most recently, to see what the experience was like and see if I could describe it for people, because I felt I hadn't read very good accounts, with the exception of Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which is a beautiful account of his mescaline trip in the early 50s, that I think has influenced every account since then. So I began it as a research project. I undertook it with great trepidation and fear. I was not comfortable with the idea. I looked very carefully at what the risks were, both physiologically and psychological. But in the end, I had some powerfully important and fascinating experiences that did raise questions about the nature of consciousness. The one that I remember most vividly and that I think was most transformative was a high dose psilocybin journey, guided. I was working with an underground guide, so which I encourage anyone who's thinking of undertaking one of these trips, that if you're working with a high dose, you should seriously consider having a guide or a facilitator with you. Because the key to such an experience is your willingness to surrender your current way of looking at the world to another. And you're not going to feel safe doing that unless you're in a very safe setting. Timothy Leary and Richard Albert talked about set and setting as being very important to the psychedelic experience, and it's absolutely true. Set is your mindset, your expectations going into it, and setting is the physical setting. So I worked with a woman who I had a lot of confidence in, and she had a lot of experience. And I had an interlude in this experience where I saw myself explode in a cloud of blue Post-it notes and then fall to the ground and create this pool of blue paint. And that was me. And I was observing it from a completely new perspective that was untroubled by what had happened, the detonation of my customary sense of self. And I was able to still perceive things without a self. And I had this kind of awareness without ego that was such a profound experience, and still mystifies me exactly what was going on. I think most of us assume that ego consciousness is the real thing, and that our sense of self is this hard, continuous, real thing. But I was able to dispense with it and continue to perceive, but from a vantage I had never experienced before. That was objective, untroubled. It felt like this is how things really are. And what happens when you lose your ego consciousness is that the walls come down and there's nothing separating you from whatever is out there, whether it's other people, nature, and the lowering of those walls leads to a sense of merging with something larger than yourself. And I had that. In my case, it was a piece of music that the guide was playing, a Bach unaccompanied cello suite being played by Yo-Yo Ma. And I actually became that piece of music. I became that cello. I could feel the bow running over my skin as he played. And I had this complete sense of being one with something other than myself. That was extraordinary. And I still, to this day, I don't know how to interpret it exactly.
So I am speaking for all our viewers to Michael Pollan, and I've been reading his book, How to Change Your Mind, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, transcendence. Now, I've had all those experiences myself, but what I want to share right now with everyone, Michael, and this is not flattery, I've been fascinated in the subject of consciousness and psychedelics all my life. And yet, your book takes us through a journey and the history of psychedelics, as I didn't know much of this material. It was very revealing to me, a lot of the stuff that you put in here, the history of psychedelics, the cultures where it was dominant and part of the culture, the science. I have not seen a more detailed description for anyone who wants to be educated around psychedelics. But I want to say a couple of things. You mentioned Aldous Huxley. So, I was very close to Laura Huxley at one time. His wife, not his first wife, but
Right.
his later wife, who did experiment with him.
And administered LSD to him on his deathbed at his request.
Right. And she just passed away recently, by the way, in her 90s. And she was a social worker. She used to help street kids, especially young girls that were basically on the street as prostitutes and so on. She was an amazing woman herself. And so she regaled me with lots of these stories. She was also very close to J. Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher. And so we discussed all these ideas about transcendence and what is fundamental reality. So one of the tenets in Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism is that when you see yourself in an object, any object, that's beauty. And when you so when you see yourself in music, that's an object or an experience, that's beauty. But when you see yourself in another being, sentient being, that's love. And they go together. Beauty, love, joy, equanimity, and transcendence go together. So your experience of, the piece of music totally confirms what we call satyam. Satyam means truth. Sundaram, which means beauty, and Shivam, which means pure consciousness, which is pure love. So, without me even talking about this theoretically, you describe it
Yeah,
in the book
without using that vocabulary, but that
without
is
using
exactly what happened.
vocabulary, but you're describing the experience. So you can rest assured that that experience has existed for,
Yes, I know I didn't invent it. And
yeah. And so it's very nice to have that confirmed by somebody who's not even familiar with the original literature, at least as it comes from Eastern wisdom traditions.
mm,
But now, last week or 3 weeks ago, uh, I took my agent, who was my agent, my book agent for my first, whatever, dozens of books. Um, Her name is Lynn Franklin. She passed this morning.
oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, she passed this morning. So about a month ago, I sat with her and Geeta Wade from NYU through a ketamine experience. And she encountered she had the same experience as you described just now. And that last 1 month, she surrendered to death in the most graceful, the most dignified, and the most wondrous way you can imagine. And this morning, she said goodbye to everyone and passed on consciously. Now, I cannot think of any bigger gift
Yeah.
that a human being can have than to be prepared for the final curtain and be totally comfortable with it.
And I talked to a great many people who have, because of their journeys on psychedelics, have gotten to that place. I profile the journalist in the book,
That's
Patrick Metis, and that the psychedelic experience, and particularly this experience of ego dissolution, or what's sometimes called mystical experience of losing yourself in something larger, is a rehearsal for death. The death of the ego is a rehearsal for death. And when people undergo that rehearsal, they have a sense that something survives the death of their bodies, and that there is something larger that they will become a part of. And I must have talked to a dozen people who had come out of their experiences on psychedelics in that place, with the result it did allow them to die with a kind of grace and equanimity that we can only envy.
yeah.
um,
Well, if you look at the religious experience, not the dogma and the ideologies and the institutions, it's only three things. One is transcendence. Number two, the emergence of Platonic truth, compassion, empathy, joy, equanimity. And number three is the loss of the fear of death. That is
mhm,
what Jesus had, or
right.
Muhammad had, or the Buddha had. And then we kind of institutionalized it, but that's the common experience.
Yeah.
And
No, it's at the very center of all religions.
so now, before I want to talk briefly about your second book. What compelled you to write that?
So this is Your Mind on Plants. I wrote for a couple reasons. One was, as I mentioned earlier, I've always been interested in our relationship with these psychoactives and how they change us. And caffeine is the one that is the most widely used psychoactive on the planet. It doesn't certainly lead to transcendence in any way, but it has a profound effect on our civilization. It began as a tool for meditation in the Sufi tradition and in the Buddhist tradition. Tea was helped you stay up for those long nights of meditation, and so it did have a spiritual cast, but it quickly changed once it reached the West into a tool for capitalism to improve the efficiency of workers, and the history of caffeine is just fascinating on how a plant changes the course of human civilization. Um, so what's interesting about caffeine, as opposed to a lot of other psychoactives, is that it's relatively new in the West. Cannabis, alcohol, opium, they go back to prehistory. So we can't really mark before and after the way we can with caffeine. Caffeine doesn't enter Western history until the 1650s, when coffee and tea and chocolate all arrive in England at the same time. and they usher in a big change. Before that, alcohol was the dominant psychoactive, and it was people drank morning, noon, and night. Even children would drink hard cider for breakfast. The reason being that alcoholic beverages were healthier than water because the water was contaminated. You would get sick from water. But an alcohol-addled population is not going to be very good at doing mental work. It's not going to be good at operating machinery. So the advent of caffeine allows people to start doing another kind of work effectively that leads to the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. It also had a big effect on science. The age of reason and the Enlightenment, these were fueled by caffeine. Obviously, it's not the sole factor, but the kind of focused, rational, linear thinking that you need to have a scientific revolution and an enlightenment. Caffeine was the perfect drug for that. So I want to just show people how our lives, the civilization we take for granted, is just deeply woven with these plants that are so powerful, so intelligent in that they've evolved these chemicals for their own purposes. But when they discovered that that these chemicals gratified human needs and desires, this was a wonderful evolutionary strategy for the plants because we humans would carry them all over the world. Plants are the genius neurochemists of nature, right? They're much better than we are. They've invented things we can't even dream of. And the reason they're so good at it is because they can't move. So their mode of whether defending themselves or attracting animals to them to do their work depends on chemistry, depends on changing our consciousness, and sometimes on poisoning us or poisoning other creatures. So anyway, that's what I wanted to look at. And opium is another example of a plant that hit on a remarkable strategy for world domination by making a chemical that, again, began as a pesticide. That's why plants produce these alkaloids in most cases. But when it was discovered that at lower doses, they would have these interesting effects on the human mind, help relieve pain in the case of opiates, those poppies, we gave those poppies incredible amounts of habitat. We cared for them lovingly. And they became one of the great success stories of plant evolution. So that's my, I want us to reconsider the ideas of drugs. You asked a little bit about policy and how we're going to change. The goal of this book, in a way, is to launch a new conversation about the place of drugs in our lives. That the drug war really got it wrong. It's been completely ineffective in reducing drug consumption, which is just a deep human drive. And the collateral damage has been so horrible. I mean, the number of people of color who've been incarcerated during the drug war, the damage to countries in South and Central America by, the drug war empowered the cartels, which have wrecked Colombia and wrecked Mexico to a large extent. And it hasn't achieved its goals. So it's time for another look at how to manage drugs and how to fold them into our culture. I really believe in America we're reaching the end of the drug war. That in the last election, 5 previously traditionally red states approved recreational marijuana. The state of Oregon decriminalized all drugs, even hard drugs, and specifically legalized psilocybin therapy. So I think we're moving into, and decriminalized nature is another drug movement that has decriminalized psychedelics or entheogens in many different municipalities, including Washington, D.C. So it's time to have another conversation where we don't just lump all these illicit drugs in this one basket, evil, but we actually look at them one by one. What are they good for? What are they bad for? Why do they exist? How could they help us? How could they help deal with mental illness? We have such a crisis around mental illness. And the psychedelics in particular are, as you well know, are proving themselves in research to be important healing tools to help the dying, but also to help people with depression, with anxiety, with obsessive compulsive disorder, with addiction, possibly with eating disorders, which are the hardest mental disorder to treat. And it's kind of remarkable the range of different illnesses that psychedelics are proving themselves helpful for, and trauma, of course, in the case of both psychedelics and PTSD. It appears that psychedelics are very effective in helping a brain that has gotten, or a mind that has gotten stuck in loops of rumination, that where habits of thought and behavior are so deeply etched that people can't get out. And that's true of addiction, it's true of depression, it's true of anxiety, it's true of eating disorders. These are all products of an overly rigid mind. That psychedelics can free that mind and allow you to write some new stories and new narratives about who you are and achieve new perspectives. And that is potentially revolutionary in mental health treatment, because the treatments we have now are not very effective and they only address symptoms, whereas psychedelics appear to address causes. And there's obviously a lot more research we need to do. There's a lot more we need to know. But given the dimensions of the mental health crisis, these tools just may be essential to saving us from a great deal of human suffering. So that's why I wanted to tell their story.
Michael, I had planned to ask you a lot of questions. Here are my notes. And you, in fact, actually answered them all in this last little bit of insight that you gave us, the role of psychedelics in emotional healing and physical disorders, and also in spiritual experience. I can't thank you enough. We have 1 hour limitation of time, so I want to end this, but I want one more question
Sure.
for you. One is, knowing now your experience with psychedelics personal, knowing what is happening in the world of academia, and knowing what is happening in the world of commerce and the world of governments, I go back to the fact that the British Empire in India came about because of the East India Company, which was a tea company. And then the British Empire in China and Afghanistan was all about opium. And now that we are actually looking at the future of drugs in all their dimensions, is there a way we can prevent capitalism from taking over as just another way to take over the world through drugs and through the legalization of these drugs, which is important? Or is there a way you think we can democratize well-being globally? Because if this is such a revolution, we can't afford special interest groups to control it. My experience now, I'm come from the mainstream, right? So as I've moved from mainstream to neuroendocrinology to neuroscience to the hard problem of consciousness to complementary integrative medicine, suddenly all the things that were already there in this ecosystem are being controlled by the original so-called doctors. And doctors don't heal, they practice. And I've always felt it's time to move on from practicing to healing. How do we make that happen? What's your insight, if you can say in less than 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah.
What you would like
Well,
to see is the future policy on these we are embarking on a new era in drugs.
well, I think let's limit it to psychedelics for now, because that's a big enough topic. I think psychedelics will be normalized along several different paths. One is the medical path. These drugs will be approved by the FDA, and pharmaceutical companies will sell them in a package with the kind of guiding and therapy that you need. And that there will be companies that will take over. There are already 350 psychedelic pharmaceutical companies getting started, and they will try to control what they can. They will try to patent everything in sight. That's what pharmaceutical companies do. But I don't think that that will be the only means of access. First of all, psilocybin is going to be very hard to patent because it grows in mushrooms that grow just about everywhere. And that is a kind of protection against absolute control. It's not very hard to grow these mushrooms. People can learn, people can get information and spores on the internet and do it themselves. So I think nature will thwart that absolute monopoly control, and thank God for that. I also think, though, that psychedelics will reach people through on a religious path. Already, there are 3 churches that have the legal right to use psychedelics. There is the Native American Church, which has had the legal right since ’94 to use peyote in their ceremonies and their healing, and it's been very, very effective. And then there are 2 ayahuasca churches that come from Brazil and that have the right to use it. There are new churches forming right now around psilocybin, around DMT, around 5-MeO-DMT. And it'll be interesting to see how the government deals with them. But this government, this Supreme Court, has been so expansive in its jurisprudence around religious freedom that I think they're going to be hard pressed to stop these churches. So there will be a non-commercial place, a religious place, where people can have access to psychedelic experience. And then there will be the kind of looser, more informal use that goes on now and will go on. The underground, so-called, will continue to thrive. Decriminalization is a very interesting legal step before legalization. Decriminalization does not involve commercialization. It basically is just saying, and there's a bill in the California state legislature right now about this, that you can possess, grow, and socially share psychedelics without penalty, but you can't sell them. You can't market them. So they're not, they won't go down the path that cannabis is going down right now, where it's very aggressively marketed to us in states like California. So those 3 paths, I think, offer some protection against the complete control of psychedelic therapy and spiritual experience from capitalism. That there won't be a complete takeover. So I'm guardedly optimistic.
That's been very helpful to speak with you, Michael. So last week, in conclusion, I just want to tell you that I was at a brain mapping conference, and there was a lot of academia there, and people were talking about, the default mode network and psychedelics, and so it's now obviously a brain conversation amongst neuroscientists. But what also struck me at this conference, by the way, was discussions in academia remain in academia unless there's a good storyteller. And you have been the preeminent storyteller, thanks to your journalistic, talents and your ability to tell stories. So this is a very important service. I want to thank you. Also invite you to our Lake Nona forum, where all the researchers will be there, because a story that remains in academia has no impact on the world. But a story that moves out of this academic circle and impacts the world and its culture is very, very important. And I'm very grateful that you're contributing to this conversation.
Well, I'm grateful to you too, Deepak, for having me on this podcast, and I hope I can make it in November and that we get an opportunity to meet.
I would love to meet, and if I'm in New York, by the way, we can meet anytime if you're.
That sounds great. I get to New York quite a bit. I have a lot of family there.
Anytime you want, I'd be happy to. But just want to express my gratitude for what you're doing for the world right now and its culture. And we are in a major cultural shift, which I think is moving in the right direction.
I hope you're right.
Okay. So
there are days when I despair.
Yeah. Before we conclude, I want Angie to stop the